Thank you for joining today's webinar, Managing the MOPR, Maryland Response to the FERC Order. This session is part of the Maryland Clean Energy Center's Connecting to the Energy Economy speaker series. We are halfway through our 10-session program. My name is Kathy Magruder. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Clean Energy Center. I'm happy to welcome the panel this morning. We have an astute and knowledgeable group of presenters and a fabulous moderator. Before we dive in, we're going to get started with a few technical housekeeping items. We do want to encourage participation from the audience. So for your reference, attendees are muted upon entry. The sessions will be recorded and posted online at www.mdcleanenergy.org/speaker series. Please use the chat box for technical support from our team. For questions for the panelists, you can submit them via the Q&A feature or by raising your hand during the discussion at the end of the presentation. We'll be doing a few polling questions this morning, and we want to walk through a test question with you. Our first question helps us understand who's with us in the room, how many of you are attending. So all you have to do is click on the radio button next to your answer and then click submit at the bottom of the box. After a few seconds, we'll close the poll and the responses should be showing on the screen now. So good, there's some of you that are joining each other. Our next question will be coming up shortly, but we want to mention that there's a polling question on who you represent in the industry. So please click on the radio button next to your best description and then hit submit, and we'll get a poll of who is represented in the audience. Great, it's a good mix of players. Thank you. This webinar, as I mentioned, is part of a series. We hope you'll be able to join us for additional sessions. The dates and the titles are listed here on the slide. Recordings of each session and additional information, as well as all of the past session recordings, are available online at www.mdcleanenergy.org/speaker series. We particularly want to thank our sponsor today. This session is brought to you by Exelon. They've been a great partner with MCEC for past programs. This is a particularly intense and content-rich topic. We know there are some of you on the webinar that may not be as familiar with the various jargon and details. So we've provided for your reference some slides that will be available that answer the question of what is the FERC? What is a MOPR? And we'll leave those for you to read. What is PJM? What is the PSC? The whole alphabet soup of who is involved in the decisions that are related to this. And then who has regulatory authority with regard to this matter? And I think that slide will be discussed in depth today, but we wanted you all to have that for reference if you should go back and look at the program later. We have some information about the Maryland response to the FERC order. And then I think we have one more slide. Yes. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. Delegate Lorig Charkoudian represents District 20 in the Maryland General Assembly from Montgomery County, where she serves on the Economic Matters Committee. Lorig is a strong advocate for legislation promoting environmental justice, consumer protections, economic justice, criminal reform, and sustainable food system. In addition to her role as delegate, Lorig is the executive director of the Community Mediation Maryland. She received her PhD in economics from the Johns Hopkins University and has been honored 3 times as Maryland's top 100 women by the Maryland Daily Record. She lives in Tacoma Park with her 2 children, Aileen and Rafi, and runs ultra marathons. Delegate Charkoudian, thank you for taking on this role this morning. Happy to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and staff of the Maryland Clean Energy Center. It is an honor to be here, and thank you to this incredible panel. I'm so excited to hear from them. Let me just start again by thanking the Clean Energy Center. You've done such a phenomenal job over several years in a number of different areas to promote our clean energy future, and in particular in educating policymakers and people in the industry and supporting our collaboration. And you've done really a phenomenal job, even in this pandemic, in making this shift to supporting our ability to connect with each other and to discuss really complicated and crucial issues. And I think it's potentially cliche at this point to say, but really what the pandemic has highlighted more than anything else is both how interconnected we are and how quickly an international crisis can bring us to our knees. And so, you know, as we look at how do we recover from the pandemic, we're also hoping that everybody understands the need to double down on our response to climate change and really make sure that we don't find ourselves in a you know, at our knees in another decade or two in response to climate change. I'll also just highlight again that the pandemic has also shown us the interconnection from an environmental justice perspective, the interconnection between fossil fuel use and health, and the communities that have been primarily held the burden of fossil fuel use are also the ones where we have greater deaths associated with COVID-19 because of the pre-existing conditions. So this is as important a time as ever to be really thinking about how to build the clean energy future, and Maryland Clean Energy Center has been just really remarkable in supporting us to do that. So thank you all again for all your work. I also just want to say that the MOPR I find fascinating. I think it's a crucial thing to understand. It gets wonky fast, and this panel that we have join me in their appreciation both for the wonkiness and the importance of understanding it if we're going to get our clean energy future right. I have to say, though, I feel like we won a prize because we get a 2-hour session this morning. Most of the Maryland Clean Energy Center's sessions have been an hour and a half, but we win the prize with a 2-hour session because this is such an interesting topic. And so I'm really looking forward to be part of this conversation over the next 2 hours. The way that we're going to try to do this is we have a couple other live polling questions that we're going to go through in a moment. And then we're going to have each of the speakers speak. We're going to take technical questions because there's a recognition of the fact that this is a technically complex issue that involves multiple levels of policy making and multiple levels of regulation. So we want to make sure people are following along. So we're going to stop after each speaker to take technical questions, and we're going to hold the bigger sort of policy questions, the where do we go from here types of questions, which is a really important piece of this conversation. We're going to hold those until after all of the speakers have had a chance to speak. So feel free to jump in the Q&A, and I'll be tracking that and making sure that we get technical answers sort of as we go along. And then after we've had a chance to hear from everybody, I'll ask some questions. We'll allow panelists to ask questions of each other, and then we'll also take questions from the audience about the bigger picture, where do we go from here? So with that, I think we have another live polling question to get a sense of what is your level of background knowledge for the MOPR? I know a little bit, I know a lot, I'm involved in MOPR related policy, federal and state advocacy, or I don't know anything about it. So folks could take a minute to click on the button next to whichever one fits for you, and we'll see who we've got. Okay, so it looks like we're all in the right place. We're going to learn together, and then some folks will be able to be introduced to this exciting topic for the first time, and others will be able to share their knowledge with the rest of us. So looking forward to that. We have, so for folks who have some familiarity with the MOPR, of course, there's questions about if you have concerns, what are your concerns? Consumer cost, fossil fuel generation, making it harder for states to stay in the regional markets, or taking attention away from more relevant policies. And okay, so good mix of issues there, and we'll have a chance to hopefully make sure that we touch on all of those today. And I think that our next slide is an overview of the, okay, no, we have the overview slide already. My apologies. Great. Well, then it is my pleasure to introduce Asim Haque, who is the Vice President of State and Member Services for PJM Interconnection. He leads the government policy, electricity, infrastructure policy, and member services at PJM. In that role, Mr. Haque oversees PJM's policy development and interactions with state government, which includes state commissions, governor's offices, state legislatures, and state security agencies. Prior to joining PJM, Mr. Haque was the chairman and chief executive officer of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. We're looking forward to hearing a general overview from Mr. Haque about PJM, how PJM functions, about the MOPR, how the MOPR will affect PJM's functioning. And then, as I've asked him to make sure that we talk about, I think one of the things we've seen over the last couple of months, over the last year, as states have responded to the MOPR, is PJM really saying that they are interested in engaging with state policymakers in a more comprehensive way than perhaps has been done in the past. So I'm really looking forward to hearing sort of what the overall structure is, and then also what the changes are that are in store as we think about how we collaborate going forward. Mr. Haque, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I have to ask the obligatory question. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, good morning. Thank you very much for including me in today's conversation. My name is Asim Haque. I am the Vice President of State and Member Services for PJM Interconnection. I'd like to first thank Delegate Charkoudian and the MCEC for the invitation to participate today. Delegate Charkoudian has developed a reputation for being a knowledgeable and engaged legislator, not just in Maryland, but in our footprint. So it's wonderful to serve on one of her panels. But she has charged me with explaining what PJM is, explaining the capacity market, explaining the MOPR and FRR. So that is a heavy lift, but I've got 12 minutes to do it. I might go a little quickly, but let's go ahead and dig in. If I could get the next slide, please. So this is PJM Interconnection. We extend as far west as the state of Illinois, and as far east as New Jersey and down the coast. That's the dark blue. The light blue comprises all of the Eastern Interconnection, which is effectively the interconnection of the bulk power system on the eastern half of the United States. And then there's also the Western Interconnection. Just to note on this slide, we've got 1,000+ member companies, 65 million folks in the footprint that we aim to keep the lights on for every single day. PJM has a long-standing relationship that it enjoys with the great state of Maryland. In the 1920s, actually, the founding members of PJM established the first power pool in the nation. They connected their high voltage transmission system to the Conowingo Hydroelectric Generating Station on the Susquehanna River in Maryland, which continues to contribute to the region's power supply today. Then in 1956, Baltimore Gas and Electric Company joined the power pool. Indeed, the M in our name comes from Maryland. So I'm very proud to represent this ongoing relationship here today. Let me emphasize at the outset that PJM is here to serve as an independent source of information about the grid and markets. PJM is an organization that has purely voluntary membership, and it's governed by an independent board of managers. I also want to note that we are profit neutral. We don't have any financial incentive to do anything other than fulfill our mission. Our primary mission, of course, is to keep the lights on. So again, PJM is here to be a source of information and a neutral arbiter in policy discussions that are occurring within PJM. Our subject matter experts are very valuable resources, and they have been and will continue to be available as Maryland policymakers chart a course for its future. And so now let's turn to the subject matter of the panel. The capacity market and what is now being called the FERC MOPR order have been the subject of a lot of discussion in our footprint, and I'm here to give you an introduction on those concepts. Let's talk about the capacity market first. Capacity market operates to ensure that there are enough resources available to provide consumers with electric service around the clock. That's why the capacity market is associated with the concept in our industry called resource adequacy. Capacity market is run once per year via an annual auction, and acts to ensure that there's enough power, that we have resource adequacy 3 years into the future. So that auction hasn't been run in a while. It's quite delayed, but let's take a super clean example of this. So when PJM runs a capacity market auction in mid-2025, it will be providing revenue to those resources who clear in that auction 3 years from that date, roughly in 2028. So PJM has successfully operated these markets, this capacity market, since 2007. It was established to address really scarce investment in power generation. In the mid-2000s, there was not enough of an incentive or maybe too much risk for developers and operators to invest in new power plants or on maintenance in existing plants. The situation was forecast to cause reliability problems on the grid. But the capacity market, approved by FERC, attracted new investment into the sector, mitigated the risks, alleviated the forecasted reliability violations, and increased the resources available to serve the grid. So a few more nuggets about the capacity market. Again, the goal here is resource adequacy. We have enough power in the PJM footprint to serve the roughly 65 million consumers and associated businesses in the footprint. And we have a healthy reserve margin as well. That puts PJM in a position where, as we sit here today, we don't have, for instance, California's problem of having to interrupt service to consumers because of scarce resources. But at the same time, we have heard criticism that we have too much power in reserve as well. So let's be clear about something. Generating resources, they want to receive a capacity payment. There aren't many generators out there saying, please don't pay us. But the capacity market is a single clearing price marketplace where, generally speaking, a megawatt equals a megawatt equals a megawatt, whether it comes from a nuclear resource, renewable resource, natural gas resource, coal resource, even demand side resources like energy efficiency and demand response. And as in any competitive market, there will be folks who get a payment and folks who don't, or folks who are getting a payment, but it's not enough because the price set by the market isn't high enough for those resources to meet their costs. But it's all for the hopeful betterment of driving down costs for the end user, for the consumer, for households, and for businesses. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, one thing to keep in mind here, though, is that capacity is just one revenue stream for generators. The bulk of their revenue, on average, is actually derived from the energy market. PJM has day-ahead and real-time energy markets. And this slide is just indicative of all of the different markets that are actually operating within the PJM sphere and different revenue streams that come into generators. Next slide, please. Okay, and that slide is indicative of total wholesale cost and that breakdown between energy and capacity. Last nugget regarding the capacity market. Capacity market is also meant to try and enable an orderly transition to newer, more efficient resources in the market, which it has. And that transition has yielded a significant reduction actually in emissions. Between 2005 and 19, for example, the carbon dioxide emissions rate fell in Maryland by 45%. Let's go to the next slide. I think it might actually have a slide that indicates that reduction. That clean energy transition continues today. As technology advances and costs continue to come down and newer resources become increasingly competitive, we expect continued growth in clean energy sources such as solar, wind, and storage resources. At FERC's direction, PJM has a plan to allow storage to access the wholesale markets, and FERC just recently adopted a new measure to allow distributed energy resources to access the markets. Let's move our attention now to the FERC MOPR order. So next slide, please. Thank you. In December of 2019, after a long-fought battle at FERC associated with states providing out-of-market support to resources participating in the market, FERC adopted a change to the capacity market, expanding what is called the minimum offer price rule. I saw previously in a slide the definition for the minimum offer price rule. We'll get into it, but a few lead-ins. So FERC concluded in that MOPR order, decided in December of 2019, that this out-of-market support has a suppressive effect on prices and could harm the capacity market, that basically that this out-of-market support tilts the playing field in favor of subsidized resources, undermining the competitive nature of the markets. The MOPR is essentially, what it essentially is a floor price intended to prevent price suppression and to protect the market by reflecting the true cost for each resource. So if you're, example, so if you are a nuclear resource and you are receiving out-of-market support from a state, then the MOPR will be applied to your participation in the next capacity market, and you will have to offer in at a certain floor that you can't go below. I will say there are quite a few exemptions to this. For instance, units that are fulfilling existing renewable portfolio standards are exempt, and there's a process called the unit-specific exemption process that allows for you to effectively prove that you should be able to offer below the MOPR floor price because that's what your costs actually are, even though you receive a state subsidy. The resource can also choose to forego the state subsidy, which is called the competitive exemption. Because of these exemptions and for a few other reasons, the industry generally believes that the MOPR decision will not hamper state public policy objectives in the near term, but based upon the trajectory of state clean energy policies, we do believe that the MOPR could frustrate long-term objectives, and PJM is committed to working with our stakeholders to find a more durable long-term solution. But in the meantime, PJM has a regulator, which is the FERC, and we must comply with those directives. We have stated that we do want to run the next auction expeditiously. I mean, the auction is really quite delayed. We have heard from our generators who rely on that revenue. This is creating great risk for them. We've actually heard from our states that have default service procurement auctions. They are having to hedge and create artificial pricing for their auctions. And we've even heard from consumer groups who are enjoying the benefit of historically low energy pricing. They're urging us to run an auction and get the show on the road as soon as we can. Again, we're balancing having to comply with the FERC directive here, running an auction expeditiously for the reasons that I stated, as well as having an understanding that there needs to be a longer term conversation about the future of the capacity market and resource adequacy. Last item, the fixed resource requirement alternative. So there is an option to effectively pull a metered zone out of the capacity market. And we call that option the fixed resource requirement alternative, or FRR. Now, the FRR allows a load serving entity, such as a local utility or a municipal power company, to opt out of the capacity market as long as it can demonstrate that it has an alternative path to ensure that there will be enough resources available around the clock to meet their load or their demand obligations. Electing the FRR is a minimum 5-year commitment. During the 5-year FRR period, the load serving entity does not have to pay the PJM locational reliability charge, and the capacity resources in the load serving entity's FRR plan don't receive any capacity market payments. Opting for the FRR does not mean a company would leave PJM. It means that a territory is being pulled out of the capacity market and will determine its own capacity mix and how those resources will receive a capacity payment. But you lose the economies of scale associated with being in a regional marketplace, which of course could have cost implications. Our preference, PJM has stated that our preference is that states and utilities not elect the FRR option. It is a serious decision with potentially deep implications for consumers, but if that is the will of the state, the utility, the meter territory, it is an option under our tariff structure, and we will undoubtedly help you through it. Wrapping up, Maryland has long benefited by being part of PJM. We're confident that Maryland will continue to find great value for its consumers by continuing its robust participation in the RTO. And to that end, we're ready to help the state meet its policy goals. Actually, this year, within my organizational fabric, we advanced a new unit that we call State Policy Solutions. It's an arm of our organization, a technical arm that is tasked specifically with helping our states advance energy policy initiatives. And we remain committed to Maryland in helping the state maintain reliable, affordable power for its citizens in tandem with helping the state meet its clean energy objectives. In closing, let me thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to the rest of the panel and any questions folks might have.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thank you for that overview and very impressive covering so many complex things so quickly. I do want to ask you to speak to two things, and then I want to take the technical question. I think having been trained as an economist, the concept of markets is fascinating to me. And there's this real conversation about how much are markets actually free markets in the energy world, with so many subsidies over really 100 years, federal and state, as well as, especially in the context of the capacity markets and PJM and across the country, where the rules we set really determine what we have as a market. So it's I think one could argue it's pretty far from a clean market in the sense of the free market in its technical sense. And so I recognize that it really is the goal of PJM and a lot of folks in this regulatory framework to essentially find the benefits that we all believe, or that they believe are there in a free market context. But the market we actually are working with is one that ends up being very determined by what rules we set. So I guess my first question is, do you agree with that as an overall kind of policy context?
Yeah, Delegate Charkoudian, I would agree that within the PJM market space, there certainly are, we'll call them, sort of non-standard free market opportunities for our resources to participate. I certainly acknowledge that. I think from PJM's perspective, what we're really trying to do is use the regional sort of economies of scope and scale to try and drive down costs for consumers. I mean, that has really been the part of the core of what PJM has tried to accomplish within its markets. Drivers like efficiency as well sort of play into that. I think that's really the benefit from a regional perspective to advancing, competitive markets, whether it is a, purely free market. Of course, I would say, like you, that we would recognize that there are definitely some drivers that contribute to what a unit can and can't bid into a marketplace.
Yeah, so I think that we can talk more about this when we have our discussion, because I'm interested in this question of essentially how we set the rules really does have a significant outcome on that market. And I think it's just worth being very thoughtful about that as each of us have a different role to play in the different rulemaking procedures. But I think that the rules we set really determine the kinds of outcomes we get in these markets. So I have, it looks like I've got two other technical questions that have come in, or I think maybe they're technical. One is, and I know we'll talk more about the FRR alternative, but how would a state implement the FRR alternative for the entire state? I think, not do you think it's a good idea or not, but I think that's a technical question of like, how would that be done? Is that, can you try to answer?
Yeah, that's fair. I think as the tariff is designed today, it is in fact the LSE, so the local utility or the municipally owned utility, that would have to elect the FRR alternative. And so how does then the state sort of play into that dynamic? Well, surely a state could order a utility to elect the FRR alternative, and that's certainly something jurisdictionally that I'm sure the utility and the state would think about and work out if that was sort of the collective will. But then it would in fact be the LSE that would elect the FRR alternative.
Potentially directed to do so by the state. Is that kind of how it would happen? Okay, great.
Yep.
Here's another question on the FRR, and I think we have discussed this to some extent, is if the state were or a utility were to select the FRR alternative, how much would the state be able to determine, I think essentially the capacity rules. So I think the question is sort of getting at, so solar is derated significantly relative to nuclear or fossil fuels. Would the state have to essentially consider the solar capacity with the same rules that PJM considers solar capacity or storage or otherwise? I think it's essentially saying, would the same rules apply within an FRR in terms of how much capacity value a asset could get, would the same rules apply in the FRR, or would there be flexibility for the state to set their own rules? I think that's what the question is.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, let me just answer it by saying that a baseline test that has to be undertaken when a LSE elects the FRR is effectively that there's enough supply to meet the demand within the metered zone. And there are some rules around the edges of being able to basically obtain that power from elsewhere. But at a baseline, that's what PJM would analyze. And based upon that analysis, PJM would say, okay, what is the capacity factor, for instance, for wind, solar, et cetera, within that analysis? Then from there, it will really be up to the state on the payment side as to how it would want to sort of compensate these resources for the capacity that it is providing to the metered zone. And so that then I think would be open for discussion amongst the decision makers.
So let me just ask another question that I think is sort of part of this on the technical side. And this may have to do with, there are some who believe that we have too much capacity. We pay for too much capacity with the current demand curve, essentially the variable resource requirement. And so that, of course, has implications for ratepayers. It also has implications for payments to certain, especially fossil fuel assets. So I think the analysis that I've seen shows that you would end up with purchasing less total capacity using a fixed resource requirement from a variable resource requirement. And I just wonder if as we're looking at what would be sort of different for the state rules under an FRR compared to under the current capacity markets, do you want to speak to that piece of it as well?
Yeah, so I think, look, the issue of procurement of reserves is an issue that we hear about with frequency, especially from the environmental community and environmental advocates. And effectively what the dynamic ends up being there is that it is a long and convoluted story, but consumers end up paying less to procure actually more in reserves, okay? For specifically the FRR dynamic, there is a requirement that a particular amount of reserves be evident within an FRR application. It would be a different dynamic, though, than the base residual auction, wherein reserves are procured. This would be effectively, a set amount of reserves that PJM would sort of say, hey, this is X percent of reserves that we believe that you need within that meter territory to ensure resource adequacy so that consumers can continue to receive reliable delivery of power.
Okay, I am gonna reserve the right to have coffee with you sometime to talk more about that question about whether we purchase too much capacity or not and what the impact is for consumers. But I need to move on to our next fabulous speaker. So
that's great.
We'll loop back in. I see some additional questions that I think others may want to weigh in on as well. So I'll hold those until everyone's had a chance to speak. So I am thrilled to now introduce Jason Stanek. Jason M. Stanek was appointed chairman of the Maryland Public Service Commission by Governor Larry Hogan for a 5-year term beginning on July 1, 2018. He most recently served as senior counsel to the Energy Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he advised on matters involving national energy policy, with specific focus on electricity issues and the operations of the regional power markets. Before that, he served in senior positions at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, advising both FERC chairman and commissioner during his 16-year tenure. And I'll just take a point of personal privilege to say that I think we're really lucky in dealing with this FERC issue, with this MOPR issue, to have Jason as our chairman of the Public Service Commission because of his deep understanding of it. And I've been really grateful and impressed with his leadership in these conversations at a national level about this issue and supporting our thoughtful conversations here in this state. So Chairman Stanek, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, Delegate Charkoudian. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'd like to also thank Kathy Magruder and MCEC for hosting this very important conversation. I typically don't like to use acronyms, and MOPR is a complicated concept. It's the intersection of politics, policies, economics, and personalities. This MOPR discussion initiated 4 years ago and has a very tortured path to where it brings us today. But I think one of the larger questions is why do we care about this minimum offer price rule? And it's because Maryland has very aggressive plans to decarbonize its economy just over the next 10 years. We're trying to get to a 50% RPS. We have aggressive goals in terms of energy efficiency, inciting new solar, new wind, getting electric vehicles on the road, encouraging more demand response, and on and on. So when we have a federal regulator, which is the counterpart to the PSC at the state level, who takes liberties with determining the extent of their jurisdiction, we see a misalignment and an inability for Maryland to pursue its clean energy economy. Oftentimes you see a sign when you go into a restaurant or a car repair shop says you could pick 2 of 3 things, either good service, fast service, or good, fast, or cheap. And oftentimes you can only pick 2 to the exclusion of a third item. And in this arena, I take a look at the MOPR and our goals and how they conflict and see how could we get both clean energy, reliable energy, and affordable energy. I think it's relatively easy to get 2 out of the 3, but being able to get all 3 is a challenge. It's not impossible, but it's something that we're looking at. As a state, we've been very engaged in the wholesale electric markets, both for energy and for capacity. So it's had our attention for some time. And I think the citizens of the state of Maryland are well represented because we have the engagement of our legislature, who are leading a MOPR work group. We've had the engagement of the Maryland Office of People's Counsel, the Maryland Energy Administration, the Maryland Attorney General, and the PSC. We've all been litigants in the proceeding before FERC for some time right now. We were disappointed when we initially read FERC's decision back in 2019, around Christmas of last year, followed up by decisions in the spring of this year, which effectively and made clear in no uncertain terms that the best way to combat the state's abilities to push their own policies is through a very broad MOPR. Over the course of the past few years, FERC gave a homework assignment to all the market participants and state regulators. And that was to determine how we could both pursue our state policies, but not affect the wholesale markets, which are under the exclusive jurisdiction of the FERC. And their concern was the fact that there would be some price suppression. And that is a legitimate concern. But ultimately, when FERC decided that we will offer one tool for the states to use, and that's that FRR that we discussed a minute ago, we were disappointed. The PSC put forward a very simple and elegant proposal to create effectively a capacity market, a competitive capacity market in PJM that would accommodate state policies, that would run side by side with the traditional RPM capacity market. FERC, without barely mentioning that proposal, dismissed it in its December 2019 order. However, there are other policies out there, other solutions that FERC did not permit us to examine, but I'm glad that the states and market participants are looking at this. A funny thing happened on the way to our discussion today, and that was a conference yesterday on carbon pricing in the wholesale electricity markets. And I know that some of the panelists participated in that at FERC. The interesting thing was, of 30 panelists, and this was billed to be an initiation of a state and federal dialogue, although somebody forgot to invite the states to the conversation, but that's okay. It was the first step in a long path. But among these 30 panelists, including Mr. Kavula, there was near unanimity that putting a price on carbon to curb pollution from fossil fuels is probably the best way of combating greenhouse gas emissions. And we heard that from supply side entities such as the utilities. We heard that from the RTOs. We heard that from all of the panelists, including some former state regulators. So that was very, very heartening to hear and to see. Although carbon pricing, whether at the federal level or at a sub-regional level, has been an elusive goal. It's elegant, it's simple, but we've had trouble getting it. There are two other options I'd just like to mention briefly in passing if we do not choose an FRR, and that is a decision that I said early on should be left to our state legislature, is a capacity substitution auction for capacity. It's effectively musical chairs swapping out the capacity obligations of existing carbon-based resources with renewable resources. And that's something that ISO New England has used to not much great success, but I think its application in PJM may yield a different result. And finally, a third solution to consider is a forward clean energy market, which is not very different than the traditional capacity market. And I would argue that it is very similar to the proposal that the Maryland PSC has put forth to run two side-by-side capacity auctions, because I do believe that capacity is an important product. It has been documented to have saved Maryland customers hundreds of millions of dollars. And while the FRR is a tool for us to consider, and I've said before that we are seriously considering it, we have to base the success on assumptions, not just doing the math, figuring out the numbers. What are we putting into the assumptions to determine whether or not an FRR would be successful? And to that end, I'm going to look forward to the discussion between the Exelon representative and the NRG representative, which are going to come at this from two opposite angles. But the state, the PSCs, the experts on staff here continue to seriously consider this, to work with our legislators and our stakeholders to figure out how we untangle ourselves from this mess that I would fully put on the blame on the shoulders of our federal counterparts. So I'll pause there, Delegate, and perhaps there's some questions.
Thank you, Chairman Stanek. I think I don't see specific technical questions, but I did want to ask two other follow-up questions to you. One is when you, maybe I'll ask you this question first, the one that I asked Mr. Haque. Just your thoughts about this question about free markets and the rules that we set and how much the rules around, I would say energy markets in general, capacity markets in particular, how close, just the importance of this question about the rules that are getting set. I think there's a danger to acting as though we're dealing with free markets when really what rules we set and who sets those rules has a significant impact on the outcome. And I wonder if you want to speak to that, especially as somebody who's been part of the rule setting at the federal level, at the state level, at the regulatory level, and in the policy arena.
I'm not an economist, but I'm fully confident to say that these are not free markets. Our wholesale electricity markets are what many refer to them as administrative constructs. There are floors and ceilings and conditions and exceptions. And what the FERC created with establishing this MOPR is no exception. There are literally dozens of exceptions to the rule, to the extent that we were trying to create a level playing field by effectively raising the prices of bids from clean energy resources that negates and ignores the fact that our fossil fuel resources have been receiving subsidies for many years. So this is not a clean environment that we're working in. We're doing our best to counteract and countermand some of the changes that have occurred at the federal level. But in my experience over the past 20 years, while the goal is to have essentially a free and competitive market, that's not what we have. And I would question anybody who thinks to the counter narrative.
Sure. Well, thank you. And there's a question here, and I was going to ask about it as well, the capacity substitution possibility as the state looks at what the states, I think you sort of said that there's, in addition to an FRR, the other two options would be a forward clean energy market, a capacity substitution. Can you say more about what that would actually look like?
So in ISO New England, which represents the 6 states in the Northeast, they embarked on this CASPR proposal. It's called competitive auction substitutions, where a resource with a forward capacity obligation, very similar to PJM, a 3-year forward market, plans to retire, they could effectively substitute that capacity obligation to a clean energy resource with the promise that the original resource, the emitting resource, would exit the market. So it's a permanent exit of the market. The obligation transfers to the clean energy resource. And we've seen limited success, and I put success in quotation marks. I think on paper, the plan made more economic sense. But ISO New England is a much smaller RTO, only 6 states as compared to the 14 state region in PJM. I believe that there would be more effectively dance partners between clean energy resources and exiting carbon emitting resources. Particularly if you take a look in the state of Maryland, we've had the announcement of 2 large coal emitting stations announced their retirement. One retired last month, one will retire next summer. So we will have an opportunity to match some resources with existing obligations with those that are departing. And I think PJM, I know the PJM CEO is open to considering that.
So it's interesting because within that context, though, and even with clean energy markets, is there a reason to believe that MOPR wouldn't still affect those resources? I mean, even if you're swapping out, would you be swapping out in a way that the payments that go to that new clean energy resource would be? And here, I think that everyone in this panel will agree that the MOPR is a verb, that it would be MOPR'd. Is that the correct use of the? So it's a
yes, yeah.
I think it's a reflexive verb. So is there a reason to believe those capacities, those assets that are kind of being swapped out wouldn't be MOPR'd, wouldn't end up kind of subject to that floor?
There would need to be accommodation to the current MOPR rules in order to allow a substitution auction to overlay. It would make little sense to have a substitution auction, but still penalize the clean energy resource by MOPRing its capacity revenue.
Okay, we'll look forward to hearing more about. I think we're going to hear more about the ideas of the forward clean energy market from Travis shortly. And then maybe we can all talk about, right, in just a moment. Okay, we're about to introduce Travis. And then maybe we can all, sorry, actually, let me just check if there's another, I'm just checking the questions for a quick moment. Yes, some of these are specific to capacity, independent. Okay. Let me just ask you to speak to this, Jason, before we move on. Questions about the independent market monitor consistently concluding that PJM markets are competitive. What are they missing? So I guess, maybe that's a question to my question about this concept of a competitive market, a free market, and the rules and those kinds of things. But I don't know if you want to speak to the IMM and the IMM's analysis of these issues.
Right. The IMM has supported the FERC's action generally. Dr. Joe Bowring has stated that this is the December order, what was a good order. And without question, the IMM supports competitive markets. A few months back, he did commission a report with respect to the impacts of a fixed resource requirement on the state of Maryland. He looked at a number of scenarios, of which out of 5 of those 6 scenarios, it would result in an increase to Maryland ratepayers. In one scenario, there was a modest benefit to customers. But as I said earlier, it's not a matter of doing the math. It's a matter of looking at the assumptions, and the assumptions that he used may be different than the assumptions that the folks at, let's say, Exelon are using to base their projections and their models.
Okay, and I think probably Mason will want to weigh in on that in just a moment. Let me just ask you one other what looks like a potentially quick technical question. If the state were to go in the FRR direction, would the state have to revise its restructuring law to implement an FRR?
It would not be an easy lift, but we would need to make a number of changes, not least of which trying to determine how we combat market power. In the current capacity market, competitive forces counterbalance any market power considerations. This is an area that I know we would have to take a serious look at. Which agency would be responsible for overseeing the procurement of sufficient fixed resource requirement capacity amounts. And I know my colleagues up in New Jersey, who I communicate often with, are looking at that very issue in their investigation of using an FRR.
Sure, and I think that fits into this other question. We'll just see if we can do this quickly, and then we'll move on with other members of the panel. For now, is I think that this fits with what you were just asking, though. Would like to hear the PSC's thoughts on balancing how prescriptive potential legislation for an FRR should be. Put another way, broadly, what level of detail would balance legislative priorities with regulatory discretion to implement? I think that's some of what you're getting at, but do you want to say a few more words about that?
I think there would be flexibility required in a number of areas, but as we stated from the outset, this is such a complex issue that whoever the appropriate agency that would be charged with administering the FRR, and it may be multiple agencies, I believe that there would be some flexibilities granted upon those agencies to act in the best interests of the state. I would be concerned with legislation that is so prescriptive that it may not accommodate or foresee changes either from the federal regulators or from the markets in real time, which could change very quickly.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason, so much. And we'll be looping back in with some more questions, I think, after we hear from other folks. So now I'm excited to introduce Travis. Travis Kavula is Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at NRG, working to ensure that energy markets continue to deliver value for electricity customers. He joined NRG from the R Street Institute, where he led the think tank's energy program. Previously, Travis served 8 years as a commissioner at the Montana Public Service Commission, during which time he served as the president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and as a member of the Advisory Council of the Electric Power Research Institute. And I'll just say on a personal note, I enjoy thoughtful exchanges with Travis. And so I'm excited to have you on this panel and looking forward to more thoughtful exchanges that we'll have a chance to have here today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Delegate Charkoudian. I enjoy those exchanges too, and thank you for your Chairman Stanek's, Dr. Opsel's, Ms. Magruder's, all the staff of the Maryland Clean Energy Center for all your public service. As a Maryland citizen, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. NRG owns or controls about 23,000 megawatts of generation in the United States and around the world. We serve a little fewer than 4 million customers on a purely competitive retail basis. Any of our customers can fire us, which is an important distinction between us and other regulated utilities. And last year we were one of the big solar purchasers in the United States. We signed 1,600 megawatts of solar power purchase agreements for our Texas customers in particular, on the backbone of sort of a fundamental economic proposition that clean energy is increasingly making. We would love to be making those kind of plays in the eastern United States as well. So to begin, I guess I'd like to first address why the capacity market is important to a power generator and a retailer like us. And it is primarily important because of something, Delegate Charkoudian, you've been pointing out, that these markets are bound by rules and that they are not a free market. And to that point, prices in the PJM energy market are capped by regulation. They were first capped at $1,000, they're moving to a $2,000 per megawatt hour cap. And that price cap necessitates a market in capacity for times when energy is would be particularly scarce and when seldom used resources need to be called into service for reliability. That market in capacity makes up about 1/5 of the revenue in the total PJM pie, which, as Asim described, includes energy, ancillary services, transmission, and capacity. I looked at my Pepco bill yesterday, and I'm right about average energy use for Marylanders, myself and my family. So the capacity market translates into a little less than 1/10 of my customer bill once you add in the state regulated charges for distribution, tax, franchise, et cetera. So you can think of my payment, other consumers' payment for capacity as a kind of reliability insurance policy because of the market rules that have restrained a freer trade in energy. Capacity markets, however, are an aggressive heads-up competition between power resources that are able to provide that product. And over the years, the capacity market has been instrumental, not just in building new power resources, but in procuring demand-side resources, as well as new efficient power plants and uprates of existing facilities. So you heard from Asim that there's about 187,000 megawatts of installed capacity in PJM. 66,000 megawatts of that is new energy efficiency, demand response, renewables, and natural gas during the 15 years for which auctions have been held. And that has led to the retirement of 41,000 megawatts, primarily of older fossil fueled resources. And when you look at other markets around the country that do not have this aspect of competition, where regulators continue to set prices based on incumbent utilities costs or run an administrative process that is less free than the capacity market, you tend to see less churn, less decarbonization, less innovation in those markets. The Southeast would be a good example to compare the PJM market to in terms of its obtainment of emissions reductions versus what's been achieved in PJM. As I said, many of the generators operating in this market don't operate often and only when severe conditions call them into service. And because they're not producing a lot of energy, those generators also don't produce a lot of emissions. And it means one more thing too. While the prices for capacity may only be a small part of an average consumer's bill, the capacity market ends up mattering a lot for reliability resources that are there to serve customers when those services are needed. So if you have a power plant needed for reliability, but running a small % of the time, the capacity market ends up covering the fixed costs of operating a power facility, such as wages for workers, property taxes, other things that are unavoidable regardless of how much you run. For existing generators, the forward element of the capacity market, 3 years in advance during normal times when auctions are not delayed, sets up a future expectation of revenues that guide reinvestment or retirement decisions, things like whether to install new environmental controls or do fuel conversions. It's certainly not hypothetical. My company has invested $500 million to do fuel conversions in our PJM fleet. Whereas I think the incentives without a capacity market might drive market participants simply to run their existing generation until it ultimately breaks, rather than making more calculated decisions around capital investment and innovation. The integrity of this market fundamentally depends on investors' expectations that they're engaged in a heads-up competition for capacity that is not biased in favor of certain actors. If we think that the capacity market isn't going to be the place where people go to earn the revenues associated with reliability, then we're back to the way the world used to work, where new projects are financed through captive customer arrangements rather than through investors taking on the risk of project development and operations. And that leads us to why we, as well as some of our peer companies, filed a complaint that ultimately led FERC to take the action we're describing today. Starting in 2016, states in the PJM region began to enact massive nuclear subsidies that benefited specifically exactly 3 market participants: First Energy, based in Ohio, Exelon, based in Illinois, and PSEG, based in New Jersey, that are traditionally some of the largest and most politically influential firms in this region. In economic terms, handing out subsidies to particular power generators distorts the market for the rest of us. And in the words of the PJM Independent Market Monitor, subsidies are contagious. They run the risk of turning a heads-up competition between power producers into a competition at state capitals for special favors, which can easily lead to corruption. To that point, in July, ComEd, Exelon's utility subsidiary in Chicago, entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, paid a $200 million fine, and admitted in a sworn statement to facilitating kickbacks and even appointing a member to its corporate board at the behest of the political machine associated with the Illinois Speaker of the House. In return, the utility secured passage of critical pieces of legislation, including the nuclear subsidies that led to the MOPR complaint. The criminal investigation is still ongoing, with the utility executive pleading guilty to bribery this Tuesday in federal court. Just a week after the ComEd news broke, a similar story, I should say, seemed to break in Ohio, where the Ohio Speaker of the House was arrested, and federal prosecutors allege that he used the utility holding company First Energy as a quote-unquote bank, channeling a total of $60 million to the Speaker's political machine in that state, again, in exchange for the passage of legislation whose centerpiece were these nuclear subsidies that led to the conversation we're having today. In this country, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has the responsibility for ensuring that wholesale rates like those in the capacity market are just, reasonable, and not unduly discriminatory. The nuclear subsidies erode all of those principles. FERC agreed with our complaint in that respect, and notably the only FERC commissioner who had experience as a former state official, then Commissioner Rob Powelson, voted for the order. Then, during the phase of the proceeding to find out how to remedy this problem, numerous parties pitched ideas. FERC, in effect, came up with a solution of their own, which is a fairly maximalist position of a minimum offer price rule, that any state subsidy should be mitigated and that projects should have to bid their true cost. And that leads us to today. Ironically, given how PJM has proposed to implement FERC's order, the MOPR probably actually won't catch up a lot of the nuclear plants we're talking about in the PJM market, nearly all of which are allowed to bid at a price of their choosing without restriction. But the MOPR is being used as an excuse for nuclear owners to feed their insatiable appetite for additional nuclear subsidies. And that, candidly, is what the fixed resource requirement alternative in the current iteration of the conversation seems to be all about. I have a few criticisms I'll highlight now. We can discuss more during the conversation, I hope. First, FRR has a poor empirical record of actually saving consumers money in the PJM region, and the proposals that have been offered to date would almost certainly increase costs, the Market Monitor has found. Second, it introduces a risk of greater unmitigated market power into these markets, a return not so much to the old days where a monopoly was subject to strict regulation by public service commissions, but to a new era where the market is kind of, to Delegate Charkoudian's point, even more kind of a half-baked construct, has certain competitive features that allow market participants to evade regulation, while at the same time having a smaller pool of resources that increases the risk of market power exercise. It's very hard to nail down the specifics of FRR proposals, but one thing that does unite them is that nuclear always seems to be first at the FRR buffet and takes the lion's share of the subsidies. And it has very little political support. Pardon me for the cameo appearance here. It seems to have very little political support in New Jersey, which is really the only jurisdiction that has delved into this with a regulatory proceeding, taking comments on the record. Everyone was called to make their proposals known, put them on the table. We put our proposal for a forward clean energy market on the table. Exelon and PSEG did the same. At the end of the day, only 6 parties out of about 30 raised their hand and said, yes, let's do FRR. And most of them, no surprise, were utilities or a select few developers who depend on utilities for their development projects. So moving to my final point, I think we need to get to a place where, pardon me here, where we get wholesale markets into a place that they're compatible with state clean energy goals, where they're going to continue to meet reliability standards and are going to procure clean energy at, I think, 2 of those variables that Chairman Stanek pointed out, at a fast pace, at a low price, and ideally in coordination with the capacity markets. As I said, we're pretty bullish, actually, that clean energy gets to competitive neutrality with other resources. That's been our experience, for example, in Texas, realizing that some markets don't have the land mass or the resource mix. There may be a price premium that needs to happen in order to get clean energy deployed at the levels driven by state standards. But in that situation, we think there should be a market that prices that premium based on clean energy providers' competitive offers, not just based on policymakers' guesstimates. NRG has a specific idea that does just that in a forward clean energy market. works on the same timeline as the PJM capacity auction, and would be a way for not just Maryland, but other states with aggressive RPS and CS goals to incorporate and clear that demand in aggregate in the regional market. And Brattle Group has written a great paper describing this concept in draft form. The next step, we think, should be Maryland asking PJM to come up with a straw proposal for what this kind of market would look like, and also to think creatively on your own about what Maryland would need in terms of governance protections in order to participate in a multi-state market. And there's plenty of precedents there on that we can discuss later. In conclusion, I hope Maryland policymakers will take steps to ensure that the state's clean energy goals can be met through a competition between power resources and not a competition for special favors. Thank you.
Travis, did you already pass your child off? We wanted a full introduction. Can we get the full introduction? You have to unmute yourself so we get the name.
Yeah, well, he's coming right over.
And what's his name and age?
This is little Julius, and he turned 1 year old in August. So say hi. So maybe you'll even get a smile.
Yeah, we got a smile.
Oh, there we go.
Love some Zoom.
My little quarantine helper.
I have to say, one of the few things that I actually like about Zoom is getting to be introduced to everybody's family. So thanks for, if anyone else has a child in their home or a pet, feel free to hold them up for the my 14-year-old may bust in and tell me that he can't get on his class in just a minute. That's been happening in my household. Thank you, Travis, for that. And I think, so you add some really interesting points. And I think that, I certainly share your concern about corporate influence in policymaking. It's something that I've looked at a lot, but I think that one of the things I want to ask you to comment on is this question about state policy versus federal policy, because we certainly have significant corporate influence and corporate money influencing federal policy, as well as state policy. So the idea of certain special interests being able to get their way is not unique to state capitals. And in fact, what we've found over the last several years, and I think this is why so many people really struggle with this, the MOPR order, is that really the clean energy movement has been at the state level. It hasn't been at the federal level. And so you have state policy that has historically and continues, especially right now, to support fossil fuels, and you have most of the movement in clean energy happening at the state level. And so when you shut down the ability of states to influence the outcomes, you actually are shutting down the clean energy piece. Even if what you're going after is some nuclear stuff, which we can talk, and I'm sure Mason will speak in a moment about its role in the clean energy mix. So I guess I want to ask you to comment on that, but then specifically, I just want to ask you to talk about about NRG's experience. So you mentioned Texas, and you mentioned that you've actually had some great success in Texas, and Texas actually doesn't have a capacity market. And so I wonder if you want to speak to, both you and Asim spoke about the capacity market being something that supports decarbonization. I'm not convinced that it's the capacity market that does that. I suspect it's the states and state policy and other things that do. But do you want to speak maybe to why you think that without a capacity market, there's been such a different experience in Texas? Maybe you could start there, and I also have a follow-up question on that as well.
Sure, happy to answer that. So Texas does not have a capacity market in the way PJM does. Instead, it has an energy-only market design that is geared to produce high scarcity prices when supply is thin compared to demand. So the ERCOT market, as it's called in Texas, has a price cap of $9,000 per megawatt hour. So historically 9 times what the PJM market energy price cap has been. And it has a feature that I needn't get into, except for the fact that PJM is also rolling forward with the implementation of this called an operating reserve demand curve, which seeks to escalate those prices and show scarcity pricing when the probability of a supply shortfall rises. And so that leads to a situation, just to give you a statistic that I know off the top of my head, where out of a 6-month period of revenues in the Texas real-time energy market, 6 months, 44% of those revenues came from a single 5-day period of summer peaks. So it's a highly volatile market. which provides huge incentives for capacity resources to be available. And it works because it is an entirely competitive retail market as well. So retailers there is no default supply entity that gets after the fact true ups and cost recovery for whatever energy happened to cost. It is entirely competitive retailers who make fixed price offers to consumers. And then if their actual energy costs end up diverging from that fixed price, it's they who eat that difference in cost. And what does that do? Creates a huge incentive to go out and essentially arrange private capacity deals in advance of the real-time operating window. So it doesn't have a centralized capacity market like PJM does, but it is a market that's regulated to the effect of providing extremely strong incentives for retailers like us to line up capacity in advance. And that leads us in turn to make the kind of deals that we're talking about with solar. And it also means that the capacity value of solar is something that we decide. We're on the hook financially for the consequences of deciding wrong. So honestly, I mean, we're happy with the Texas market. There would be a lot of changes that would have to be made to get PJM states to that point, but it's a market that works really well.
It's interesting. There's this question here in the chat, the question and answer about this European markets not having capacity markets as well. This is a question about the role of and the importance of capacity markets and their value potentially in creating the reliability, but there are other ways to create reliability and the potentially that we've moved past the time that capacity markets are the right tool to do that. So I think that's a question we can all discuss after we've heard from everybody. I just wanted to ask one other question, and it really comes back to this question that I'm sort of asking everyone to comment on about the rules and who's creating the rules. Again, in thinking about, you mentioned that the Southeast compared just to the Northeast, you mentioned the Southeast states compared to the Northeast states in terms of the decarbonization that we're seeing. And I wonder if the decarbonization in that comparison that you're making is tied to capacity and the capacity rules or competition. You mentioned the deregulated markets, or you also have a difference in the Northeast states and the Southeast states in terms of state policy around clean energy and how much we're all willing to really promote clean energy at the state level. So I think like with anything else, you sort of have this difficulty of sorting out, is it the deregulated markets or is it the clean energy commitments on the part of the state? And I just want to ask you to speak to that as well.
Sure. So at least in PJM, and I'm talking only about PJM here for the time being, a lot of the decarbonization that you've seen happen has not been as a result of state mandates, but has been a result of coal switching to gas in the PJM footprint. And that really has been driven both by the falling price of natural gas as a fuel over the past 10 years or so, also by capacity markets, which in sending a forward signal that promotes new capital investment to clear out old capital investment allows for this kind of dynamic substitution, and through energy markets as well, just like what is the energy market price. There has been an effect of state policy, but I'd say it's actually secondary to the coal to gas switching. I think the next layer, how do you get more clean energy? A lot really will depend on state policy and its requirements, especially if, and Dr. Bowring disagrees with this, but especially if you believe that renewables, in order to be competitive, do need some kind of price premium in general for wide-scale deployment in the PJM region. So that thus are calling for a market-based construct to identify and price that premium. Other regions are different. I mean, the Southeast does have probably a lower renewable resource in general, though not one that is so different, I think, from the mid-Atlantic necessarily. It does have a different political culture, but I think what really distinguishes it is that it doesn't have these competitive market features that allow for some of the churn that you've seen in the PJM marketplace.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to go on to our next speaker, who is Mason Emnett, sorry. Mason, welcome. And Mason oversees the development and implementation of federal regulatory strategy for Exelon Corporation, the nation's largest producer and distributor of clean energy. Mason is responsible for achieving Exelon's policy objectives in matters before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and Environmental Protection Agency. Prior to joining Exelon, and it was a senior FERC counsel for NextEra Energy, which followed 8 years of service at FERC, where he was Deputy Director of the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation. And Mason, welcome, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts. And I think to some extent you'll answer some of the questions that we're starting to get about what could an FRR look like in Maryland. And I know there's questions about the various structures that could address some of the concerns that have been raised. So please.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks for being here. So, as mentioned, we're the largest clean energy generator in the United States. One out of every 9 megawatts comes from an Exelon facility, with the bulk of that coming from our nuclear generation fleet. We also have a very large utility footprint, 10 million customers up the Eastern Seaboard, essentially from DC up to Atlantic City, and then the Chicagoland area. And then to Travis's point on competitive supply, not quite as many as NRG. We got 2 million, but we see these issues, from multiple angles. Harkening back to Asim's discussion of the PJM history, we own the Conowingo plant, and we own the PG&E as part of the Exelon family. So we are founding actors in the formation of PJM, and we have longstanding support of markets and the operation of PJM. Agree that the regional efficiencies gained out of the PJM market have driven a transformation in the industry, and that's great. We are supportive of regional market operations, but we have a fundamental concern when the goal of the market operator is reliability at least cost that doesn't take into account clean attributes in a world in which very cheap natural gas, that we can argue about whether it has been subsidized or not. I'll kind of come back to that. But in a world where very low energy prices resulting essentially from fracking and natural gas are driving out the clean resources, the existing clean resources of the nuclear fleet. And so that is what's leading to conversations in the states, the SEC programs that Travis referred to, but also broader conversations like Chairman Stanek referred to of, where are we now and where do we want to go, and what type of investment is it going to take to get there, and what state policies do we need in place. And what we're getting is a regulatory, a market structure through PJM and a regulatory structure through FERC that is not particularly conducive. In effect, it's quite kind of antagonistic to state clean energy policies, which is bringing us to this conversation. So if we could flip to the next slide, I do kind of want to level set. So we saw from Asim the Maryland version of this. Across the PJM footprint, yes, we acknowledge there have been significant emissions reductions over the last, decade, 15 years-ish, as Travis said, largely driven by coal to gas switching with coal retirements. But what's interesting to us is to actually look forward. So we think there are a couple of things going on with the information that PJM provides. One, it provides the tip of the iceberg. So what are the reductions, but not what the total amount of emissions are. And it leaves off the future of how are we going to get from where we are today to the very significant emissions reductions that are needed. And that raises the questions that Travis was discussing about what are the market mechanisms that are signaling the investment that is needed, that's providing the capital needed for the literal transformation of our generation stack. And are the market structures we have in PJM going to get us there? And I think I agree with Travis that the answer is no, that it is going to be dependent on state policy as to how you get from here to there, which leads us to this question of the MOPR. The states have been very active in this area, as we've been discussing, and in response, what you have gotten is the MOPR litigation. So if we could switch to the next slide. So as Travis acknowledged, this MOPR conversation is because PJM, the IMM, NRG, and other companies went to FERC and complained about state actions. And that has led us to the place where we get a set of rules. PJM was kind of characterizing this as FERC has directed us to do X, Y, and Z. That is true. FERC has directed it, but it has been in response to statements made by PJM, NRG, and others that are supporting this action by FERC, which is, we believe, seeking to undermine the state policies that are trying to push clean energy and the transformation of our industry. I mean, I will kind of pause on, we've had a lot of discussion about subsidies. Travis said, we have specifically us, Exelon has an insatiable appetite for subsidies, pointing to activities that have occurred and our ComEd footprint in Illinois. We do have a deferred prosecution agreement with respect to lobbying activity that ComEd was engaged into with respect to distribution rate policy that was not related to the clean energy program, including the zero emission credits. It's kind of convenient for Travis and others, the opponents of state action, to complete that with the clean energy program that was adopted by the state. The clean energy program itself, the Future Energy Jobs Act, was supported by 60-ish organizations at the time. It was bipartisan in nature. The legislation that was adopted, it was supported by environmental groups, including some that are arguing at the PJM footprint that the actions by ComEd should implicate our participation in the market. We think there's just a lot of confusion of the facts going on, and so want to kind of set that record straight. At the same time, we acknowledge that the small number of actors in ComEd did not live up to our own expectations as to what appropriate conduct should be. We've apologized for those actions. We've taken responsibility, and we've implemented remedial requirements to ensure that things like that can never happen again. But to translate that into the conversation about subsidies, or state programs to support particular types of generation, NRG is in those same rooms that we are in on the Exelon side. In Illinois, NRG has been advocating for a specific subsidy program to shut down its coal plants in exchange for payments that are received by lower RPS payments, so about $250 million in transition payments to coal facilities out there. So there is an active conversation that's going on at the state level with policymakers as to what we want our policies to be as we engage in this transformation. And I think we should all just be honest that is what we are doing, right? We are advocating for our own interests, and in our particular situation, our interest is preserving and expanding clean energy. On the fossil side, I just note that the subsidies that have existed for fossil for years, there's an IMF study from last year estimating total fossil studies in the United States at $649 billion. So, we appreciate the statements offered by Travis that, we're interested in fair competition at the regional level in a wholesale market. But when you are a clean energy provider that is entering that market, again, can folks hear me? Because my screen just went off.
We can hear you now. You kind of cut out for a second. Can you say something else? Mason, you there? Wait, now you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? It looks like you just muted yourself.
It wasn't even me.
Travis, it was you. Can someone from the Clean Energy Center try to unmute him? I don't think I have that ability. Oh, there you go. Say something.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. My computer, and then now everything just followed. My computer just went totally blank, and then, but now if you got me. So anyway, just to close out that point, we operate in a market where if we had a transparent carbon price, as we were discussing at FERC yesterday, and as Chairman Stanek was discussing, we'd essentially all be good, but that's not the market that we operate in. And so we are all engaging with policymakers on what resources they want to support and how to move forward. So if we could move to the next slide, sorry for losing some time there. So what does this mean for Maryland? What does the MOPR mean for Maryland? As Asim said, there are exemptions from this MOPR policy. So the MOPR is, because a resource receives state payments, it cannot offer below a certain amount in the capacity market. Therefore, it runs the risk of not being selected. What happens, PJM will select fossil resources in its place. That's just the mechanics of what will happen. If you look in the PJM queue, There's about 235 megawatts that's going to be of solar, just as kind of drilling down on the solar example. 235 megawatts of solar in the existing queue that's going to get the exemption that Asim was talking about, and the remainder is not. They're just going to be subject to the MOPR going forward. And so the question is, will those resources effectively be able to participate in the capacity market? And then you ramp up, you need about 850 megawatts in the next auction cycle, 22-23, to meet the Maryland RPS requirements. And those are going to ramp up over time. And so you see that just volume-wise, there's going to be an increasing amount of generation that Maryland needs to meet its RPS requirements, even putting aside how you get to 100%, but the existing program, and what are the implications for those resources as a result of the MOPR. So we could flip to the next slide. Rob Gramlich at Grid Strategies, former PJM economist, former FERC economist, has provided some estimates on what the cost impact is going to be for Maryland. He comes up with a number between $650 to $950 million of consumer impact associated with the MOPR for Maryland over the next 9 years. Now, there are a lot of assumptions in this. We don't know what FERC's final rule is going to be on the MOPR. We do have a time frame now, though. Yesterday, FERC filed, or now 2 days ago, sorry, FERC filed in the underlying appeals of the MOPR decisions, a status report with the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals indicating that the MOPR decision is going to come sometime between October the 7th and October the 15th. So we have a couple of weeks to get ready. Once that order is issued, PJM is going to be off to the races in terms of implementing its auction. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But the real question here is, what are the costs going to be for Maryland consumers associated with the MOPR? So very busy chart. But you know, the long and short of this is that there is going to be some cost. We don't know exactly what the cost is going to be yet. Some estimates are quite significant, and so you know, we agree with Asim that in the long term there's certainly going to be a frustration of Maryland clean energy policies, and I think where we then disagree is, well, what does the long term mean? How soon are we getting to the long term? On the FRR costs, we'll kind of skip to the next slide and talk about that, because I think we need to think about what the cost implications of the MOPR are and compare those to what are the cost implications of the alternative solutions that might be able to be implemented. So as mentioned, we support the FRR, the fixed resource requirement. This is the only tool that is available to Maryland or any other state to take the kind of capacity decision back from PJM and decide the resources, kind of how consumer money is going to be spent on this energy transformation through the capacity market. There are other mechanisms that are available, like the forward clean energy market, transitioning to a carbon price, kind of lots of options, but those other options are not available to Maryland right now. They're not under Maryland's control. They'd be under PJM's control or FERC's control. So it's not that we don't continue working on them. We just strongly advise Maryland and every state to seriously consider the FRR, because it is the option that is under the state's control and it's readily available to be used. There are a bunch of benefits associated with the FRR in our view, but I think the main point here is this needs to be a conversation. To pick up on kind of one of the detailed questions that Asim got about, well, if you do the FRR, is the resource that's participating in the FRR subject to the same requirements as the resource subject through RPM? This is where things get interesting. The FRR has a ton of flexibility in the way that the state would want to run a procurement, but one of the benefits is that you can measure performance on a portfolio basis. So if you have something like, say, a high performing nuclear resource that operates 96% of the hours, and you've got renewable resources which fluctuate a little bit more over time, you can measure your performance on a portfolio basis. And while PJM is kind of qualifying a particular resource for a specific amount of capacity, the actual operation of that capacity of that resource at any particular point in time goes into the portfolio. And so you can have lots of interesting conversations about the way that the state values resources compared to the way that PJM values resources. That can only happen within the FRR context. So if we could skip to the next slide. The last thing to kind of end on is from our perspective, why this FRR conversation needs to be happening now. So as I mentioned, FERC has now given us a bogey in terms of order action. So that's roughly kind of in the first, second week of October. PJM has proposed to return to its auction 6.5 months after that order. So that's going to put the first auction roughly around the beginning of May. There are some other things that are going on, including a related proceeding involving energy and ancillary services and energy market changes. This could fluctuate a little bit, but we got a bogey for late spring now for the next auction, which then means that successive auctions are going to start to run very quickly. So by the end of next year, PJM will have already run through 2 auction cycles. Now, in each one of these auction cycles, they spend over $800 million of Maryland consumer money on capacity. So they will have undertaken 2 procurements by the time you kind of get to the point where FRR could be implemented, even if the legislature adopts some proposal in the spring to be implemented next year. In the event that that doesn't happen and you slip into the next legislative cycle, you're now effectively missing 4 auction cycles. So PJM will be committing capacity all the way out to the 2026 timeframe, locking in commitments from fossil and pushing out the clean resources. So we agree with Asim that with respect to the next auction in 22-23 happening sometime in late spring, it's unclear what the specific impact of the MOPR is going to be because of the exceptions, but those are going to roll off. And you're going to be facing procurement decisions that go well into mid-decade. And to tie back to what Chairman Stanek said is Maryland has very aggressive emissions reduction goals and clean energy transition goals that are occurring in this decade. And if half the decade is already gone because those procurement decisions have already been made, we think that's why people need to really take stock of what the options are in the near term to prevent these long-term outcomes. So with that, I think I went over. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mason. I'm going to ask you just one question, and then, but it may be a big one. Is that we want to make sure we get to Ryan and get some discussion. So I think you know that I have engaged with your team, with a lot of environmental groups, really looking at this issue. I share with you a lot of the concerns about and Rob's analysis of the impact on consumers. I think is a pretty useful one to be looking at. I know the IMM has a very different analysis, but his only looks at the very first auction, I think. But the question is, and I think this has been a struggle for policymakers and advocates within Maryland, is because of the unique mix of Maryland resources. If Maryland went with an FRR, whether a statewide FRR or an LSE specific FRR, the reality is that that Exelon owns a lot of the generation that would sort of be within those sort of LSE, the zones that we'd have to be purchasing the capacity within. And so in particular in a constrained zone of BG&E, but even if we just did a sort of a PEPCO FRR, we would have some of those challenges. And so the question I think is about how what Maryland might do with market power. And I think specifically to you, to Exelon as the company that's promoting FRR, as a company among other advocates are also promoting FRR, what do you think we could put into place in Maryland and really to make sure that you don't have market power? I mean, that's really kind of what the question is. So others may want to speak to that as well, but I think that's really where the struggle is, this question about market power of the resources that we have, especially because we have limited resources and limited ownership of a lot of the resources that are not fossil resources.
Right. So I appreciate the question, and this is something that's coming up. I think it was Travis mentioned the New Jersey proceeding that's ongoing. It's a significant question that's there, and we acknowledge that it's significant and it needs to be addressed. We don't advocate for the FRR because we think we can corner that market, which is essentially the implication here. We are participating in a market now where environmental attributes are not taken into consideration and have no ability to be taken into consideration. And so that's why we want to engage with the states to say, well, how would you make this choice? How would you structure some market auction mechanism that does take environmental attributes into consideration? And then you have to answer this question of, well, we own a lot of those, and what do you do about that? So the kind of direct but maybe not completely satisfying answer is it depends. There are choices that the state could make that would kind of confine the area in which the state is looking to resources to participate, that would effectively give us the market power. We think that those would be the bad choices for the state to make. But when the IMM analyzed the FRR impacts for Maryland, that's exactly what he did. He assumed that the state would be making some kind of illogical choices to give us market power, and then assumed market outcomes from that. The way that the zones are kind of configured within PJM is that some of the zones in Maryland effectively have greater access to the broader PJM footprint. And our recommendation would be to use those zones to run the FRR, because then you're expanding the pool from which you can pull resources, diminishing that market power concern. There'd still, I think, be some concern as to, okay, well, if you're focusing on clean and one market participant owns so much clean, you'd still want to make sure that there are some protections there. There are options there too for the state. It's similar to alternative compliance payments right now for renewable programs. If you have an oversubscribed, an undersubscribed renewable program because you need more than you can just physically get in a year, or if it's the opposite and you're getting more than you need, there are effectively pricing mechanisms within the RPS program to ensure that no single market participant can say, well, you really need me, and so I'm going to charge whatever I want. You can adopt those same programs in the FRR. You can use the RPM clearing prices as other proxies to kind of peg off of. Their jurisdictional things. You need to make sure that as a state, you're not overstepping bounds in terms of setting rates that are subject to FERC jurisdiction. But we think there are lots of options here for a conversation.
Okay, we'll probably be getting to have those conversations as we continue with the work group. Thank you so much, Mason. Let me switch to Dr. Ryan Opsahl. Dr. Ryan Opsahl is the Director of Energy Policy at the Maryland Energy Administration. He previously served as an Energy Policy Manager at MEA. Prior to working at MEA, Ryan was an adjunct professor in the Politics and International Relations Department at Florida International University, where he completed his doctorate focusing on energy politics. And I will just say, I think we're really lucky in Maryland to have Ryan in the mix of policy conversations. And I'm really grateful that you're here with us today, Ryan, and take it away.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. So thank you, MCEC. It's certainly a pleasure to be here today talking about this very important issue. So we've heard from some wonderful panel members today, and I think a lot of great information has really been provided. One of the things we really try to do at MEA is to kind of take as much of a strategic view of a lot of these issues as we possibly can, balancing these sometimes competing objectives of clean, reliable, and affordable electricity in the state. The latter of which has certainly taken on greater importance given the devastating toll COVID-19 has taken. So today, though, the main message I would like to communicate is one of patience and consideration with this issue and the need for a thoroughly researched response to this long-term threat to state-level energy policymaking, and indeed really our sovereignty and ability to dictate our own energy mix as we see fit in the state. So our current view is one of moderation and continues to be one of information gathering. And this would also include the potential FRR option, which I'll get to in a moment. I should, however, point out clearly that if the MOPR order remains in effect, it will certainly be detrimental to our state's efforts to have a cleaner energy mix down the road. So first of all, why do we have a little time to decide on this issue? So first of all, there's a couple of legal challenges to this order currently in progress. Hopefully they will succeed. Right now they are consolidated in the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago. So this is a legally contentious issue. In general, though, I really don't think you can appreciate the issue itself without breaking it down into its distinct time dimensions. So on this issue, it's important to understand the short-term ramifications as separate from the long-term ones. So since this conversation is really centered on our ability as a state to continue to provide meaningful subsidization to preferred generation resources in an effort to incentivize faster deployment of clean energy technologies, we can focus on these technologies, which usually we're talking about wind and solar. So When it comes down to it, though, there is extremely limited renewables participation in the capacity markets auction, and this is demonstrated by the results of the 2018-2019 base residual auction, simply because the majority of renewable operators do not depend on revenue streams from the capacity market or ancillary services for that matter, but instead sell directly into the energy market. What that means is these onerous rules targeting renewable generators, and I would reiterate target, given the exclusion of action on federal subsidies across generation types, as has been mentioned a few times in this conversation. So what it really means is over the short term, renewable generation is essentially not being deprived of capacity revenue since they typically do not pursue these as a primary revenue stream. Now, admittedly, on this point, information is extremely difficult to come by. This is not through malign intent, but is within the competitive best practices of renewables developers to maintain control over such information. As such, it is not freely available, and we are forced to instead rely on anecdotal and proxy evidence. It should be noted that existing resources are exempt from the MOPR. So even though we have limited involvement by renewable developers, the ones that have been involved and have already cleared or participated are exempt and will continue to participate. And this also includes one of the 2 offshore wind farms that will be built in the future. As for direct policy interventions, we're usually talking about something like subsidies or grants like MEA's solar grant program, or the subsidies through an apparatus like the renewable portfolio standard, where preferred generation is awarded renewable energy credits. These systems of financial subsidies and other like them are the main financial instruments of state policy, and they are intact and are not going anywhere. So when does this become a problem over time? It's difficult to say precisely, as has come up in this conversation. But it will become a major problem if the MOPR itself is not rescinded or significant modifications are not made and retained. While there's limited involvement in the capacity market now, given our targets where we currently have a 50% RPS and the probability that clean energy subsidies will increase, and you'll have increases in these percentages over time for clean energy, we will be looking at a grid that is increasingly directly subsidized by the state, which means more and more of our grid is actually going to be captured by the MOPR, which means also more and more would be prevented from competitively engaging in capacity auctions. It's not too difficult to look ahead and see what that would mean when the grid is at 50% or 100% of subsidized clean energy. This would be extremely problematic. In addition, as technology improves and we look for the potential of additional enabling technologies like utility scale battery storage, we would assume that more variable generation like wind and solar would have the ability to more successfully operate in the capacity market. This especially goes for technology like battery storage, which would then mean we would also be depriving those developers and generation types from an additional added revenue stream, making overall project economics worse off. So now the fixed resource requirement, which of course has been one of the main points of debate here. It's a potential avenue to mitigate the long-term detrimental impacts to clean energy development resulting from MOPR. But I would say it's something that should be approached with caution. There are many unknowns with engaging in this option, and we would need to subject it to more study before making a decision. First, going FRR is of course not like picking FRR from a menu and you're there. The decision has to be made in advance and you're locked in for 5 years. It would be a commitment. But before this, it would be the result of a bargaining and negotiating process as we determine what to include, what would be capable of including, and perhaps most importantly, we would need the necessary expertise on hand to properly develop and structure our state level procurement. We would need to be careful about this, and this will not only impact the functioning of our capacity in the state, it will bring to the fore issues of competitiveness and market power, owing to the potentially limited number of firms that would be participating in these state level auctions, especially in particular LDAs and individual zones within those LDAs. So it would seem the potential exists to mitigate some of these market power concerns to a limited extent. However, they would not be eliminated. We would have to determine the area, whether we have enough generation there to meet our requirements, determine how much generation would need to be indigenous and within that LDA, and how much potentially could be imported from PJM for capacity. All of this would feed into that complicated negotiated process. So second, executing the FRR option at this time, I'm not convinced would be a boon for renewables. As previously mentioned, we do not have enough renewable energy in the state in order to come anywhere close to meeting our capacity obligations, even under an FRR option. We don't have enough when we take into account our RPS obligations, much of which in the tier 1 non-carve-out category consists of RECs purchased outside of Maryland, meaning the generation is not in state. We have a deficit of renewables that are able to provide capacity in state. That means the in-state generators that are currently receiving capacity payments from PJM auctions will still be a major part of the in-state capacity resource mix, which means fossil fuel generators. The bulk of our capacity payments over the near and medium terms would most likely be going towards in-state fossil generation, which would be counter to the goals laid out here today, which is to mitigate the negative impact of the order on in-state renewables and furthering development of our preferred generation mix. There also seems to be a question as to how much control we would have as a state over assigning value to capacity resources and over choosing what would be allowed in the auctions in the first place. So third, we also have concerns of pricing and the ultimate cost to consumers. Certainly these costs will be significant over time. But the limited information that is available is, in general, not encouraging and mixed. And so, as has been mentioned, the independent market monitor came out with a report earlier this year focused specifically on Maryland. 5 of the 6 scenarios resulted in price increases. They had to do 6 scenarios because of the inherent complexity of the energy landscape in Maryland with multiple LDAs and significant portions of electricity from the broader PJM network, also adding to the complexity of this whole situation. And 4, on the issue of other states, there are other jurisdictions that have elected to go FRR, but I would caution drawing direct inferences, the Maryland case. First, these are a mix of different geographies, congestion zones, sizes in terms of customers served, and differences in the status as a regulated or deregulated state. These are significant directly applicable variables that need to be addressed in order to draw proper conclusions from these other jurisdictions. And so once again, this is a serious issue. We're not flat out rejecting the election of the FRR, but we are saying, as we said in the beginning, we have time for careful, thoughtful consideration. And there is no need to engage one of our state's LDAs in a contractual obligation that lasts 5 years. We take more time to research the issue more thoroughly. I think all the panelists and the moderator have made valid and well-founded points on this issue. It is certainly complex to say the least, and we will certainly continue to review, research, and monitor this issue. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Let me ask you 2 quick questions, and then I want to open it up. Oh, then I think we have a survey interactive. Make sure everybody's still paying attention. We've got to keep the surveys in there to make sure people can at least press the button. And then we'll open it up, but we've got about 12 minutes left. So I think one of the questions I just wanted to check with you on is, you said one of the challenges is that the capacity payments, at least initially, would include payments, if we went with an FRR, would include payments to fossil generators. But that's currently the case, right? I mean, right now, the vast majority of capacity payments are going to fossil generators across PJM and in Maryland, which is, of course, I think one of the challenges and one of the concerns when we think, do we pay for too much capacity, that is fossil capacity? And then, so in that sense, I think one of the as we consider the options, it's not that more money would be going to fossil generators. It's just a question of could more of it go to renewables? Is that, I want to make sure I got that piece of it right. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean that is certainly part of it. But if you do go FR, and look, I'm not saying that prices would necessarily go up if we were to go ahead and execute the FRR option. But I am saying there is the potential for that to occur. So you could potentially have a scenario where you are paying more under the FRR option, and then what you're paying in addition is going to end up going to those generators, which I assume you do not want them to go. So.
I don't.
But look, it is contentious. This is it's really difficult to say at this point, and it is really difficult to determine costs at this point with any degree of at least focused accuracy, because we don't know how this is going to be structured at this point, right? It's still up in the air. How, you know, even what LDA we would choose, you know, what the auction structure would look like, you know, how that entire process is going to play out. That is, of course, all up in the air. And that of course feeds in, you know, that is like the key variable in determining how prices are going to look in the future.
And I think, so the two other areas I just want to ask you about is offshore wind and storage, because I think one of the things as we're looking at our future in this state, there is, I think PJM has walked this kind of fine line in their filing with FERC that has to some extent assuaged some of the concerns that solar and land-based wind have, but it still leaves offshore wind out for all intents and purposes, and it leaves storage, and now we'll see storage rules will change a little bit with the new FERC order, but any subsidized or state-supported storage would probably still be MOPR'd. So I guess I'm wondering if you can just speak to that, because it seems that as we're really looking to grow offshore wind, one of the two offshore wind projects in round one will get MOPR'd, and then all of the offshore wind projects in the round two, the 1,200 megawatts that are bidding right now, will get MOPR'd. And so essentially they're bidding right now without the ability to bid in with an assumption of capacity payments. I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, because I think those are two really significant areas where MOPR will affect the decisions really in the next few years about investment in offshore wind and storage.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a concern. I would point out the capacity payments, at least according to previous analysis on the current offshore wind sites as it currently stands, or the forecast, those are relatively low. But of course, you would have the potential for those to grow over time. And of course, as capacity and capacity factors are increasing over time for renewables across the board, including certainly offshore wind, where you're typically going to have, you know, that more steady flow of generation of offshore wind there. So, you know, this could certainly become problematic down the road. And you know, at that point, I would say, you know, yes, we need to really take that into consideration and figure out how we are going to mitigate the impact of MOPR. But, you know, as it stands right now, we're not looking to have these new wind farms in place really anytime soon within the next few years, which kind of goes towards my central point that we have a little bit of time to really examine this as critically as possible. But you're absolutely right. And when you're looking at those capacity payments in the aggregate for the entire additional megawatts that we actually will need to procure over the course of the next decade, that could certainly potentially become problematic. And so, yes, absolutely. And to the point of storage, I think, you know, storage is perhaps one of the best capacity resources you could possibly have, right?
Ironically, getting zero capacity payments right now.
And look, and it really would be excellent, right? I mean, look, right now the storage is very expensive, but the prices are certainly coming down. But you know, the fact that you can have that stored generation right there that is, you know, dispatchable, you know, immediately is very valuable in that area. So you know, absolutely, I think that is something that we would love to see in the capacity mix. And I think as this conversation progresses, that is something that we would certainly like to see in any efforts to mitigate these negative impacts.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to have a survey question is going to pop up in just a second. And while it's popping up and folks are taking a look at that, I'll just let the rest of you guys know that you're going to get a 45-second closing points. So I was hoping we'd have more discussion, but we've had great discussion as we've gone along. So I'm going to go in the order that we started, and everyone gets 45 seconds of sort of a lightning round of closing out. Any additional thoughts that you have, stuff that we should be thinking about, advice for those of us in getting ready for the legislative session, whatever you want to do in your last 45 seconds, as soon as we get folks input on this, this question right here. We'll see. Okay, there we go. Let's see. We will start with Asim because I think you went first. So if you'd like to go.
Yeah, look, I just want to thank you again, Delegate Charkoudian, as well as the MCEC for the invitation. Look, I think that, you know, in my close, I would just like to really preach patience in all of this. The temperature has been quite high on this issue. I would say that, look, we PJM ourselves have recognized that the MOPR is not likely to be a long-term durable solution for states looking to advance clean energy policies. Our doors are completely open to listening to potential solutions to what the next iteration of resource adequacy and the capacity market could look like. Simultaneously, you know, we have got to continue to move to run an auction. And what I would say is that you know, once that auction is run, we will get some results, right? We will see what the impact of this order actually is. And so that is my close. Let's just preach some patience here.
Thank you for that, Asim. Jason.
Thank you, Delegate. I thought this was a great constructive conversation today. At the end of the day, you can't blame the states for wanting to consider alternatives or an exit to the capacity market in order to protect their resource adequacy and their state policies. I agree with Asim that I think we all recognize that the current capacity market in its current form is not long for this world. So we need to figure out what comes next. I would agree with Mason that the FRR is our only option provided by FERC, and it's a tool, but I don't believe that the FRR is necessarily a solution. It pushes a problem around, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And while we as the PSC will continue to look at FRR as the only option on the table, I'm hopeful that we could get to a place in the not too distant future where we're looking at substitution auctions, forward clean energy markets, and of course, carbon pricing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And winner of the cutest baby on the panel, Travis.
Maybe there'll be tougher competition next time, but I'm glad he's got the crown. Thank you for having me again. I will say I would love an exploration of some of those other options that of course do require PJM and the federal regulator to participate, and a forward clean energy market substitution auction. I think are two of those promising options. Even if they require the consent of a federal regulator, there's a lot of thinking that Maryland and PJM and other stakeholders could do together to try to package something. There's a new CEO at PJM. There's the new group Asim heads up on state member services. There's a presidential election coming up that will change what FERC looks like. It'll change it either way because there's 2 pending nominations to FERC right now, including 1 former state commissioner from your neighbor, Virginia. But if there's Democratic president, the change will be even more profound, I think we can safely say. So I think it's good thinking to try to skate to where that puck is heading. And do a little more thinking about what other options that are in the vein of cooperative federalism might be. Finally, I love
that's gonna be your last word. We're going to Mason.
Okay, thank you.
Oh no, yeah, I'll be quick as well. Yeah, I think my key message is the long term is here. You know, we agree that we should be thinking about all the options, discussing them, working through the details. But it took 5 years of litigation to get to where we are now with the MOPR. So even if there are changes in the administration or at FERC, it's going to take years to get there. Even with leadership by PJM, and frankly, we're not seeing the leadership yet. You know, quite yet, even though we're welcoming of the conversation. So by that time, PJM will have engaged in procurement decisions out through 2026 and beyond, and spending $800 million of consumer money, largely on fossil at this point. And the question for the state is that the path you want to be on? And that's, we believe, you need to answer that question sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Ryan, you get the last word.
Well, I'll just end on a high note and say, this is really great. This is a wonderful panel. I think as been seen on this issue, we have some really great people here in Maryland involved in making our way forward on this issue, and really look forward to working further with everyone here.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for your thoughtful commentary and to welcome the conversation going forward with all of you and other stakeholders, many of whom have been weighing in. And I just want to say that for folks who have asked about whether or not there'll be access to the slides, there will be both the recording of this and whatever slides the panelists choose to share will be on the Clean Energy Center's website. And I think what you see here is upcoming conversations, really good conversations so far. They've been fantastic, and I look forward to participating in these others. And I will just say that while I'm willing to engage patiently with everybody, I do want to sort of light the fire for urgency around the broader issue of climate change. We really don't have a lot of time to play with. So I hope that we can move forward collaboratively, certainly in deep discussion, but also with great urgency, because the clock is definitely ticking.
Thank you, Delegate Charkoudian, and all panelists. I just want to close us out and say again, thank you from the Maryland Clean Energy Center. I'm sure all of us who listened in learned something today. I certainly am overwhelmed with all the information that is now in my brain that wasn't before we started this webinar. We look forward to further discussion, and if it's useful for the Clean Energy Center to continue to have these types of webinar programs on this topic, we're happy to do that. So we'd like to hear from our audience. I do want to mention that we are now accepting nominations for our 2021 Advisory Council. If you'd like more information, please go to our website or contact our office. The next program is October 8th, and the topic is Optimal Solar Siting for Maryland. We look forward to seeing you back then, and you all have a great week and a great weekend. Bye-bye.